listen, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me today. Chris, my guest is Dr. Christopher Kerr, PhD in neurobiology, MD, CEO, end-of-life researcher, and Chief Medical Officer of the Hospice and Palliative Care Unit, Buffalo. Did I get all that right, or am I missing a few bits? I know you're an author also.
Yeah, no, you got it.
I got it, yeah. Perfect. This is crazy. Yeah, I you know what really has me looking to speak to you? I know I messaged you a little while back and you were on leave. I have this podcast, Thought and Truth, and well, really, it was training thought and truth, and it used to be the physical, mental, and spiritual elements overlapping, and myself trying to develop each aspect of my life in that way, and trying to get experts in them fields on to help others learn. And I dropped the training part, the physical side of it, because it was becoming a fitness podcast, and there's plenty of them out there, and I wanted to delve into deeper conversations. The thought and truth then, well, I guess I've been talking about metaphysical issues or deeper kind of issues about life, and I came across your TED talk. I think I actually came across it about a year ago, and I really was really interested in speaking to you about it. So that was what kind of called me to this meeting. But I know from your initial sentence in your TED talk, you were saying that something called you from an early age to the field you're in now. Would you like to talk a bit about your background and what that was?
Yeah, I actually think it pulled me away, but it's funny how life works. You kind of end up full circle in an odd way, whether you mean to or not. What my point was in the TED talk was I actually had I'm a hospice doctor, but I was actually extraordinarily death averse. I mentioned that my father died when I was a child, so there was that element to it. And then when I was confronted with dying patients in medical school, of course, training doesn't help this. My aversion to dying only accelerated because it's a cure-all culture. And we actually fragment the care. So when somebody is no longer treatable, we kind of distance ourselves. So I really didn't. It's easy to be death averse in medical school, was my point. It's a safe place to be. And what happened was, it's just coincidence, or maybe not. I was a cardiology fellow, so highly at the interventional end of acute medicine, and needing to make money for my family. And I saw an ad in the newspaper for weekend help at a hospice. So it was, I wish it was some great aspiration to help mankind, but it was really practical. I needed it to work. So, I started to work with dying patients, and I had this recollection from childhood, seeing my father at the end of his life. When he was making references that from his inner experiences that were not part of my reality at that moment. And I carried it with me my whole life, and I really didn't speak of it very often. And so here I am at hospice decades later, and I'm confronted by this thing from childhood, really, that I had seen, didn't understand, and it kind of haunted me. So that's how I kind of ended up being full circle. And the irony, of course, is that I end up starting this work, and it was the most meaningful role I'd ever played as a physician. And so I went to my chairman in cardiology, which ironically was a very competitive field, and said, I want to do this over here. They wanted me to see a psychiatrist, the whole thing.
Really? Wow.
Well, now it's a trained fellowship. To give it some scale, in our town, there's probably 50 practitioners of palliative hospice medicine. At the time, there were 2. Wow. So it was something you did when you were retired and burned out. So anyways, that's kind of what I meant.
Yeah, but it is interesting, you're saying by coincidence, and you're kind of, you're highlighting that word. I often do wonder, and you might allude to see if you think this way as well, that a lot of people's experiences kind of go towards what they'll be in a meaningful aspect of life. I always think that you could do the expedient job, but there's also another call to something maybe a bit more meaningful. And even your work and publishing your books or your documentary even probably could give a lot of people who have lost someone a bit more comfort, maybe hope that there is a life after death, because the trouble I find is that, if you talk about the afterlife to people, you're kind of discredited in their eyes almost, they kind of like, no, it's nonsense. Half people might say that to you. But then there's so much evidence about it, not just from end of life visions, but near death visions. And, you see surgeons converting after seeing these things, saying, wow, there's definitely something else going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's an issue why this isn't more in the scientific field? It seems like there's some kind of barrier not to talk about it as much. You know what I mean? It's not so. You won't see it published on the headlines of the paper. The evidence, proof of the afterlife, but you interviewed over 1,400 people in the get-go. Do you think there's some kind of push back against that narrative?
Oh yeah, very much. I think basically what's happened is, as medicine's become more capable on the scientific side of it, it's just kind of abandoned the art of it. And I think we live in a strongly evidence-based time. We can image, we can understand cell lines, gene expression. So we live in an era where we can always dissect and understand the objective world. What that has done is that's inadvertently caused us to let go of the things that we can't see. And so, dying has become a medical paradigm to solve. It's defined in terms of its organ failure or futility, something no longer works that we can fix. Whereas dying is actually a closing of a life, and it's a much richer human experience. And that's what medicine has lost hold of. And the reason our work, continues to go in a storm around the world is not because it's new or necessarily novel at all. It's that I think we're contributing to a movement that wants to reclaim or recapture dying as something that has a deeper human value, and that includes aspects that are actually life affirming. And what drove or propelled our work, I never actually thought what we do would ever get published. And then it ends up in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic. It's so spectacularly done or novel or creative. What it is that it resonates with people who are at the bedside and actually see or experience. So we were holding the wrong end of the stick. We were trying to originally, my goal, I was interested in just publishing it because I was trying to teach it to residents and students, and they were saying there's no evidence. It was littered in the humanities and in religion, but not necessarily in science. So that's why we did our studies with a lot of rigor, and we filmed people, which ironically becomes part of a documentary. So I was trying for one audience, and it seeped out into the lay press, and the people who were experiencing dying or witnessing dying outside the medical world, of course, were saying, yeah. So what it did is it provided a framework, basically, for people to have some form of validation of what they were experiencing at the bedside. When I say medicine, I should clarify the nurses, people who actually work at the bedside, they know this stuff. Like it's preaching to the choir. It was more the physician community who was less aware.
Yeah, and I remember you saying that, this woman, Nancy, you're talking about that patient, Tom, and, she knew that he was close to dying based on the visions. And you were kind of alluding to, well, I didn't learn that in medical school, which is interesting because it seems like it's such a common and fundamental part of the whole process, and it's left out. And you said something there. You said, people were tying it to a kind of spiritual, religious side of things that, they couldn't could have put it in a framework. And I wonder, with our history, with the scars of organized religion, where people tying that in with the same, tarring it with the same brush, maybe, and not wanting to go down that route. Because I do know from looking back and reading that I think it was Galileo Galilei who tried to remove the search for the soul from biology studies. Now, maybe I'm wrong in saying that, to progress other areas of the field, because they had such an issue with locating the conscious mind, or what the consciousness or the soul. They're trying to link them together, and it seemed to be there's a big step over that side of things. And like you said, there was probably no framework then. Things went on without it. And it is, I'd imagine it was a very hard push for yourselves, being kind of the first people to break through that, because we do live in a scientific age now, and the worry is that things become, human life becomes less transcendently valuable, I guess. If everything's seen as, like you said, organs are fading, they're like parts of a car almost, when when you talk about it. And you imagine with palliative care, what you'd like it to be is not the abandonment of someone dying. You nearly want, what's the big difference between the process of birth care and dying care? It should be held to the same regard. Do you find that there's a bit of a less regard for the dying in the medical field?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, medicine is very transactional, and when there isn't when there isn't a treatment, there's abandonment, and the life becomes inadvertently kind of less respected or less regarded. And I think what we did is, so we were very careful to put this and do this in the language of science. So these were university approved studies. We did things like used very validated instruments to rule out confusional states. We obviously then filmed people, so you couldn't miss. They weren't relying on us telling them. Massive amount of data. And we were very careful not to extrapolate. So we didn't take what the patient was saying and say, this means this in the religious or paranormal or afterlife realm. We just wanted to merely translate what dying patients were relaying to us. And that's what was so fascinating, is we're so bent medically in the physical domain. We had inadvertently failed to recognize that the patient was having a change in vantage point and perspective and perception, that there was a lot that was rich going on in their inner world, which kind of makes sense. It's these profound moments. And we even did a study looking at this notion of post-traumatic growth. Can something positive be happening within this largely negative, viewed negatively, experiences, which is dying? And people continue to learn and grow and understand right up until their last days of life. So clearly, we're dismissing something that's actually very vibrant and pretty astounding. It's just experienced from patients in the bed's perspective. It's not observable. You can't biopsy. You can't scan it. It doesn't take away the fact that it's happening for the patient. And it happens in children, and it happens in the very old. And what you end up finding is there's a better story than the one we would imagine. That these events are largely comforting. They're meaningful. They reconnect people to the ones they've loved and lost. And again, that they affirm life. They don't deny death. Not like this isn't happening. It's actually quite the opposite. But yeah, it's a neat story.
Yeah, but it's interesting as well. It's nice to think that people have comfort in the end. I was talking to my partner here, Charmaine. We're talking about loved ones, just because we're on this topic, and I was looking at a few bits of your own. And we're talking about recent loved ones who have passed, and we're talking about that seemingly the fear of the unknown early in their prognosis compared to on the last day or so when the fear seems to seep away a bit, and there's a peaceful element. That's nice to see. It's nice to see that it's almost a comfort to the people as much as it is to the person who's passing. But in palliative care, imagine it's somewhat different than hospitals because you are intertwined with that person. Like you're seeing that person at their most vulnerable moments, and not only that person, but their whole family, around that bedside, and you're hearing people's life stories. And I'd say it's quite hard to, I'd imagine the first couple of times you experienced this, you were pretty blown away. Did it kind of rock your worldview?
Yeah, because first of all, it's very unsecuring because you feel untethered, right? You're used to a hospital, you're part of a team. There's always something to do, and it gives us false illusion that you have a clearly defined role. And then what happens is you're abandoned. You have no more tricks in the toolbox, and you learn all of a sudden that your role is to be present. And the physician actually does have a role as comforter, and that is inherently therapeutic. We're not doing to someone, we're not intervening, but at a very human level, it's pretty meaningful, and it kind of goes to the richnesses of the calling in the first place. And really to the oath that, where you can't cure your comfort. And you find out it's a pretty cool place to be, and it matters. So when you kind of redefine the objective, which was, let's just say, to cure or to reverse or to slow a disease, and realize that you're actually treating the person in totality, it's extremely rewarding, and clearly more so today because there is such fragmentation and abandonment in care, and so the need is even greater today.
Do you think? I've often heard stories, and you might say if this is more true or not. That when people have these type of experiences, they become sedated. It might be the go-to option in certain palliative care centers that maybe they're not understanding of what's going on. I'm sure if they work there, they probably are, maybe. But there's a tendency to sedate people and up the dosage a bit as they get closer to life. Do you agree with that statement?
No, it's actually one of the most misunderstood parts about palliative medicine. Actually, the data is less medicine is used rather than more. Clinically, you need less medicine. Dying for the most part is comfortable. You get it's defined really by a desire over time to eat less and sleep more. There are a lot of reasons why there's less pain. If you have bone disease, you're not weight bearing. The pull to sleep becomes very strong inherently in the dying process. It's not that there aren't use of pain medicine, but it's not to the magnitude that people fear there are. There certainly are patients. What's really important in our work, though, is and people do have altered mental status and cognitive status, particularly before the end. But in our studies, we're not talking about the moments before death. We're talking about the days, the weeks, and even sometimes the month before death, when people are having these kind of differences and experiences. I think that's an unfair fallacy that people are medicated. There certainly are cases that's undeniable, but it's sad because I really speak a lot against this, because what you're doing essentially is our work shows that there are these inherent processes to dying that are comforting and meaningful. And if you have to over medicate, that you're sterilizing somebody from their own experiences, and that's problematic. Sometimes the over medication really is a lack of knowing what the hell to do. in the management of patients, and that certainly happens. So, they'll say, this patient is no longer this. We're going to start around the clock morphine, and do that. I can tell you that we take off as much drug as we put on most days, and the interventions that are needed are not particularly sexy, but they're things like constipation, urinary retention, coughing. It's not 10 out of 10 pain.
Yeah.
So
I'd imagine that maybe it might be the case if someone was going through a particularly horrific experience, maybe with these visions, that maybe it could calm someone down. Maybe in that scenario it could be. I have a close relative who I only found out the last few days had a negative experience, had this experience in the first place. I didn't know they did the day before they passed. And it was a negative one. And it was someone who was quite religious and spiritually good, cornerstone of our community. And you wouldn't think, she would have went through that, and it's sad to hear that she did. But she followed on by going home and being able to die peacefully at home among her family the following day. But I think she was given that sedative, but I think that was a case where there was a lot of panic involved. It's maybe more so in that scenario.
Yeah, it happens. It's about 15-17% have negative or discomforting dreams. It's really important that these experiences don't sugarcoat the life that was led. It's more complicated than that. Some of the negative experiences are actually some of the most transformative experiences. So if you were in war, the idea that you would relive elements of war is true. But we often see, like the fellow I spoke about in the TED Talk, is that that's when somehow they find forgiveness for survivor's guilt. We've got a person in the Netflix documentary who had a more or less, because of drug use, abandoned a child, and he had horrific dreams, but that forced him to reconcile the abandonment of the child and ask for forgiveness. So we see very positive pieces come from that. It's really important to separate what we're talking about from agitated delirium, which is extremely common. So if, and I don't know the case of the patient you're referring to, but they had been sleep deprived, let's say in a hospital, woken up a lot, unmanaged pain, those are near universally negative, and they're extraordinarily agitated. So that's delirium. What we're talking about is people whose cognition is very much intact. So they're not disorganized in their thinking. They have to be, to participate in our study, they have to be aware and actually clear all those hurdles for participation. If somebody gets to delirium or agitated confusion, they're often very, very sleep deprived, and they're often frantic. They're reaching, trying to get out of bed. That's a different experience.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to liken this to what you're saying. Is I understand that the Johns Hopkins College is doing a lot of studies lately on psilocybin use and the experience of that. And again, I'm not trying to tie that into what we're talking about here, but when they do tie in the research a lot to near-death experiences, at least I think, and they say it's but at the same time, the reason I bring it up is because they say them conditions and them stressors make a big difference to what they experience when they go into that process. So I can get what you're saying, that the environment or that person's mental condition at the time can have a massive factor.
Yeah. In fact, when you talked about dying in physical pain, we have an inpatient unit where we admit patients who can't be managed at home or often in hospital. And by far, what's more common for the reason people need to come in is not physical pain at all. It's psychogenic pain, it's agitated confusion and delirium. And the backstory is usually you've got a sick, frail person who needs to sleep. and either something's keeping them from sleeping. It could be constipation. It could be being woken up regularly, get your vital signs checked, but you can induce confusional states, and those are all often agitated. Yeah. So the point though you're making is correct. The way somebody goes into this absolutely sets the stage. Yeah.
Yeah. You're talking about you have your PhD in neurobiology. Where I'd imagine it's a science that goes right back to the cell, it goes right back to the origin, and neural networks and everything going. So in taking that kind of frame, what do you put down as the cause or the origin of these experiences? Where these
neurobiologically?
Sorry, not neurobiologically, maybe the neurobiology, we can see how our full body works and all the signals that are being sent, and there's you can kind of see a reason why things degenerate. But I'm asking more maybe a spiritual question. What do you think is behind these experiences yourself personally? I know that's not something you can test, but it's certainly something that someone with experience could have their own thoughts on.
Yeah. So I'm not. I'll disappoint you because I'm not predisposed really to think in these terms, and so I went into this more as a skeptic than I did than anything else. I think where I end up is, first of all, respecting what I don't know or can't see. I end up kind of inspired that there's a better story than the one that we might fear or imagine. I say that because what I'm continually in awe of is that in the end, the themes that people tend to focus on and relive are themes of love and themes of forgiveness, and they focus on the people who loved and secured them most. Mm-hmm. So it's like that they were never gone. So that there's this constant for having lived. Doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter when you lost a parent or a child. That permeates all of this. So I think there is something that sustains and propels us and ties us to the best parts of having lived. Where that resides, I have not a clue. I'd have about as much luck as saying, show me where love is on an MRI. Mm-hmm. I have no idea, but it's undeniable. So yeah, you mentioned near-death experiences, and these are so qualitatively distinct from those that it's very interesting. Near death, I don't know a lot about them. I have a layperson's understanding, but people come out of those experiences with a kind of a playbook or a new understanding or a need to fix, redefine, proselytize, whatever. Like you're propelled to action in your own life and whatever. And what we find at people at the end of life is it's not a trial run, right? It's the real deal. There's no more time. There's no more time for therapy. And so these people come out of, or when they're in the process of dying, they just have the sense of knowing without even a need to disclose. It just is. So
it's like a gain knowledge almost, is it?
Yeah, it's done in absolute terms. We measured many times the realism of this for them, and it's essentially virtual. The most common thing we hear is, "Oh no, it wasn't a dream at all," or "I don't normally dream. This is actually what transpired." What's very interesting is the closer they get to death, the more they want to go back to whatever it was they were experiencing. They're often disappointed they woke up. So this is a happening in them, not to them. and they don't come out with a need to
rewrite their story.
or write a book. Yeah, they just
But it's certainly interesting though. It certainly makes a case for a designer or some kind of spiritual
or
world,
continued consciousness or something, right?
Mm.
Yeah. We were really, really, really careful because our concern was, I think we just, again, we wanted to honor the story. I think you lose a lot of audience when you try to then superimpose your own belief systems or editorial. You asked me personally what it meant to me, and honestly, that it's comforting to me. It's impossible not to do this work and feel better on it doesn't feel like finality. People leave us very much put together, and how people leave us really informs us, particularly in grief. We've looked at 900 families, and we've looked how they process loss, and if they're part of these experiences, it very much reframes how they see how they experience the loss of their loved one, and it just kind of makes sense.
Has it alleviated some part of the fear of death for yourself or family members?
Yeah, I'm not on the side of the fence that I hear some people. I think it's incongruent to be completely fearless of death and then at the same time fight like we all do, like hell, to stay alive. I mean, it's innate in us. We should be fearful because we wouldn't be alive if we were casual about living. So, and we're all fearful, at least I am, of the unknown, but it certainly does. It takes an edge off of this. It makes me feel as though the things that I've loved and treasured and lost aren't necessarily gone from me, because I see them so commonly return to people at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a 95-year-old who lost his mom when he was 5, at the end of his life, re-experiences that person as though they're there and present. So it's mothers who've lost babies, things like that. It's that's hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I did see, just going into a bit more in detail, your breakdown of these experiences. Something like 72% of people, they experience people who are already passed, and it's 59% of people have visions of them preparing to get ready to go to transition. 29% experience the living, and 28 are other but meaningful experiences. I know we talked a bit about the certain situations that can be bad experiences, but I often do wonder as well, is there any cases where you think, there's a particularly, maybe this isn't the right question to ask, but there's someone who doesn't, I put it this way, like I heard Stalin on his deathbed, right before the end of his life, his daughter reported that he shook his fist up to the sky and he cursed God before he passed away. And it's supposed to be a common story. Is there any of them you think that you seen, that bad experience from people who just seem not to be appreciative of life? Or do you know what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, I honestly haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Of all the emotions that I've seen, anger or rage is not one of them. The only thing that I can kind of put in that specter is unfinished lives. People like a young parent who's it's very different to die when you don't have the responsibilities to other lives in the same way. So someone dying at 80 versus 30 is entirely different. There's a psychological trauma in that I think I've seen. It's hard to find true peace. I've seen it, certainly seen it. but it's harder. But I haven't seen what you're describing at all. I really haven't. But it would be wrong not to say that there aren't struggles in dying for people, and the category for which that's most true is people who have unfinished lives.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you go to somebody who's 90, particularly who's lost everybody, they're tired and they look forward in odd ways to the end of it. So I see that. I think it's a more age independent experience.
Yeah, I guess, we have fear of dying, but when you get to the age of 90 and your friends and family and siblings have gone and you're getting this feeling of peace and, like you said, the pain is alleviating and you're even in your bones, even on a physical scale, you're probably like, well, look, if they've gone before me and I'd like to know that, they're there. And certainly your work shows that there's a good, strong possibility they are. But what about then as well, you have obviously the other end of the scale where children are passing. Are their experiences similar to those of 90-year-olds? These
No, in many ways they do it better. And some of these children are in the film there, and there's a whole chapter on them in our book. And we've published a case series on them in the literature. They do this very, very, very interesting. They for one, they often haven't known a person who's died. So a lot of our adult patients, their comfort comes from being reunited with a deceased loved one. What a lot of our young children have done is they've known a pet that died. And it may not be their pet, it may be a neighbor's or grandparents, whatever. But the animal comes back with the same message. And in our children's words, it's, that they're not alone and that they're loved and they're going to be okay. And they'll do things with a lot of, with really rich imagination. So they'll create a castle. When you ask the child why the castle, well, it's a safe place. So the other thing that happens with children that's interesting is we often struggle with the language on how to tell them and, what and when and the whole thing. And they seem to be able to self-inform a lot from these experiences, because I think there's less of a chiasm between the imagined world and the real world. So they just accept on faith what they're experiencing internally. And in the end, I think they're more receptive to being comforted by what their heart is telling them than what their eyes are seeing in our shared wake state. So children do this very, very, very well in many ways.
It's interesting you're saying about the pets and again, not liking it to any other experiences, but you hear that a lot with near-death experiences as well. And it's something that kind of gives people comfort as well. It's hard to put down a pet for a lot of people.
Well, I think it's kind of a cool part of the story, which is that there's an editing process that goes on this reflection when you look back on one's life, right? So you're not going to worry about your bills anymore or where your car keys are. You're going to automatically shift your mind and heart's focus to what truly has mattered. Mm-hmm. And so it's not surprising that kind of goes to, and if you think about it, and it goes to we tend to discard the people who conditioned love to us or harmed us in their love. And so it's not uncommon for someone to dream of one parent, but not another, two siblings, but not that third. And pets are unique in that for most people who have had one, it is a form of unconditioned love that we give and receive. I know people who are assholes to other humans, but boy, they're pretty special with their dog. And the effect of that, particularly from early childhood. So we hear a lot of people who could be in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they're re-experiencing their dog from early childhood. There is something special and singularly unique about that dynamic. Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
People hold animals, and particularly dogs, I suppose, at a high level because of that reason. I think, I seen a paper published on a study saying that you're more likely to give your dog prescribed medication than you would yourself. You're more likely to stick to that routine. That's quite.
Yeah. And if you believe with the follow the money philosophy, that's why it's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States.
Yeah.
Is because they truthfully can't squeeze enough money out of people. People will. I've seen lots of stories about this. Deny themselves food, but not the pet.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you hear many similar regrets from people older in their age, say the 90-year-olds, people who have lived long lives? Is there a common regret thread?
Yeah, and it's the stuff that makes sense. We did a paper on wisdom and dying, and it's what you would expect in almost any self-help book, right? I wish I had worked less hard. I wish I had been more expressive to my loved ones, not hung on to hate, all of those sorts of things. But what I find interesting is that as people get closer to death, again, what's so interesting, it becomes experiential. It's not philosophic anymore. So they're in the throes of something. They're not looking back and pondering and philosophizing or regretting or retabulating or formulating. They're just existing in this thing. So I think you hear a lot of those kind of reflective editorials, people who are upstream in illness, as they're either aging or they're newly diagnosed, and there is reflection. Whereas people towards the end of the life are in something, if that makes sense, rather than looking back. It's actually very much in the present for them. They feel that, and I can't emphasize enough that what they're telling us is, no, this is happening to me. So they're not putting it in the context of a distant past.
Even to talk about dreams, or these people are having their visions in their dreams. I'm sure they're having waking visions also, which is commonly what you hear. And even studying, like yourself being a neurobiologist, studying dreams is a very difficult thing. Even studying our conscious mind, or where that comes from, or how to locate it. It's almost, I've read studies saying that something inside people dreams. People don't dream. It's like something else trying to teach someone a lesson, or trying to get out. Can you talk to any of that as from your neurobiological experience?
Yeah, no, what I can say is that I'm really uncomfortable with even calling them dreams, because if we're listening to our patients, what they say is this is different. And when we ask them whether this occurred in sleep or awake, 50% of the time it's happening in wakeful periods. But it's not like you walk in the room and they're having these experiences. So when is it that they're experiencing, and what are these things? So the nomenclature is flawed, right? Because if the subject of our inquiry is saying this isn't that, yet we keep calling it dreams, it may be dying. Changes sleep architecture. So the clock gets lost in and out of sleep, day, night, there's this blur. One explanation may be that they're lucid dreaming. So they're dreaming in that phase of sleep that feels most experienced. And also so that they do actually feel awake. I stopped trying to figure that part of it out a long time ago, because it impairs the ability to just accept what we're being told. I don't have an answer. I was stunned when we did the early studies, and so we said one of the questions was, this happened when you were asleep, awake, or both? And half the time they came back awake. And I'm thinking, well, this can't be. And in our first study, we were analyzing over 500 responses, unique responses. So, I mean, it's not like it was a couple of guys down the hall. I mean, it was large numbers, and I've never understood it. I still don't, and you could do a sleep study on these folks, but it would feel very intrusive. And I don't, our understanding wouldn't change the reality, I guess. I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, it's interesting when you hear like the purpose of dreams, or even how that manifests itself in the human brain. It's still such a deep topic for discovery, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I do think what's interesting is from our vantage point, there's such a bias towards looking at the dreams as a pursuit of unresolved issues or manifestations of the subconscious mind, and da 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 da. And I don't think these are any of the above.
And you yourself, have you ever, when you talk to people about anything spiritual, metaphysical, even if they're complete atheist or against it, everyone has a story of something that happened to them that seems a bit, everyone has a story of, something that was very strange or supernatural or metaphysical, that happened to them. You yourself have come across any of that in your own life?
You mean from a dream state?
Maybe from a dream state, or I suppose the spectrum's quite wide. Any personal experience? Yeah, maybe from a realistic dream state that was particularly meaningful.
Yeah, it's a very common one. It's a more phenomenal, what they refer to as a phenomenologic one, which is kind of an awareness that somebody close to you died.
Mm.
And that's always been within the lore. Is that, and there were some actually very early writings by a physicist named Bartlett in the early 1900s in England, who got very interested in this topic for that reason. I've been contacted by a lot of people about this who they're with an elder parent who's aware of the loss of a sibling somewhere else. That's the only thing I can think of.
That's interesting, isn't it? To experience the loss of someone who is not physically or even in their environment necessarily. It kind of exceeds biology to that extent, doesn't it? It's another link on the chain almost, isn't it?
Well, it's actually the story that started some of this research by this physicist. His wife was a doctor in England, and she was caring for a woman who was dying postpartum, and her father had died in a neighboring town, and they decided not to tell the young dying mom. And then she starts referring to her dead father. Mm-hmm. So the doctor goes home and tells her husband, the physicist, hey, guess what happened to me at work today? He became interested in this topic, even though he was a hardcore bench scientist. And he wrote beautifully on the topic, and then did some of the earliest, best work on what we're doing.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me, do you think that that this whole the palliative care, I know it's really to comfort people at their last moments of life, isn't it? That's the whole process of the whole idea, is to keep people at the patients at maximum comfort so that they can make the transition as easy, or is that clinically
that's a version? I think the best definition is it's to optimize one's quality of life.
Okay.
So that may be so they could be years from dying, but that they have a complexity of needs. It could be from pain management, it could be religious, existential, it could be from the practical, like the social work end of things. How do I set things up to pay for my kids? it's that whole spectrum. It could be practical needs in the home. I need different wheelchairs, access into my bathtub. So if you define it more broadly in terms of how does one live with bad illness, and for a good quality of life, that's the objective of palliative care. A very, very, very narrow piece of that is the care at the very end of life. But it occurs much further upstream. And really then the objectives, though, in terms of relief of suffering, are really all forms of suffering, not just, again, the physical is kind of cookbooky. But what we're looking at is more existential issues.
Yeah, I know there's a girl, Dr. Was it Jill Smith, who wrote a bit of a book on this mental and emotional care when people enter the palliative care place, where maybe it's to avoid them type of experience that you're talking them small percentage and the negative experiences that they can I suppose you can see from a family's perspective, they don't, if their mother who's ill, they don't want them pulling up the infant that they lost years ago, while they're on their dying bed. But obviously there's a whole lot of research that indicates that makes the process a lot better, isn't it? Like, it's like the dream of the war, where it was initially bad, but once he got through it, yeah, I suppose it's like any psychological care. But there's definitely a good space for that to happen in palliative care, isn't there? The therapy of emotional.
And I think the part that's missed is this idea that dying is this passive process, right? Which is that the patient's just lying in the bed and it's a lessening. And I think what a lot of research is showing is actually there's a hell of a lot happening, and you cannot deny the realities that this person's experiencing, including reflection on their life, no matter what you view its quality to have been. But we sterilize dying people. We put them on the shelf. We treat them as though they're frail, and which they may be physically, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are psychologically and spiritually. And clearly, there's a lot going on. These are precious days and hours, and there's a lot of profound work going on. But I think we tend to shortchange what's actually happening in the bed.
Can you speak to experiences? I know there's a lot of people who experience their past relatives, but we often hear of experiences. You read about people, feel like they're crossing the river, they're going up the stairs, they're at the pearly gates, and these other type of experiences.
Like over a third of our patients experience have at least one experience that includes themes of travel or preparing to go. What I always find so interesting is the metaphor so obvious, yet they don't come back and relay that. I don't know why I was crossing this river in a canoe, and but they don't put it together. That I've had some great ones. Somebody who's dead picks them up in a pink Cadillac, and we're driving through our old neighborhood. Why would that be? So yeah, it's this idea of a change, of heralding change, is very, very, very real. But it goes back to this idea that this is less of a platform for analysis, because they're not coming back and saying, well, clearly it means I'm going from here to there. To them, they just went in a pink Cadillac, right? So it's kind of funny, but I don't know what to make of it. But I think it's fascinating that they don't feel the burden of having to dissect and analyze.
Yeah. Is there a place for someone to come in and say, well, maybe this means, whatever? I'm guessing they're loved ones who do that anyway.
I guess only if asked. I think it's great, though, that they don't feel compelled to share. They don't necessarily feel compelled to, there's not a need to have somebody do their work for them. again, it goes back to this notion that it's just this lived experience and it's taken at face value. Mm-hmm. And, I've just gotten so respectful of the process that even though I tend to be a busybody, I'm less likely to delve into to this.
Yeah. People have reported similar experiences through deep meditation and things like that as well. It's quite interesting if, people in the process of dying, and say people who are in deep meditation, are they going to a level of consciousness a little bit above and beyond, what we're generally experiencing on a day-to-day?
Oh yeah, I mean, clearly, I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of overlap to heightened sensory events and deeper access to the mind. And I mean, a lot of indigenous people have reproduced those phenomena. I don't pretend to know a lot about it, but what clearly happens is that they take us from a different vantage point than we share in the present, and there's something more profound at work. And you can get there through a lot of routes, whether you're talking psychedelics, meditation, your diet, but yes, yeah.
That's interesting that, the East, they have these traditions in the East of what we're taught. It's like the West is only catching up to, the deep spiritual roots from these, the way people used to do things, the holistic approaches. And, you often hear about, the shaman, or, they seem to know a lot of deeper spiritual elements. They still seem to hold them fundamentally in the Eastern cultures. I think the West, maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but they've become so scientific, so technologically advanced.
That's exactly what's happening. I've had a lot of fascinating conversations with an Australian filmmaker named Lynette Walworth, who is one of the leading Emmy Award winner in virtual reality, and she's worked with all sorts of indigenous folks in South America and in Australia, and clearly, not only is this multicultural and transcends history, but it's more the case that this is something that's always existed that we merely obscured in the West. And it's from an anthropologic or cultural standpoint, for a lot of peoples, this is a very important way to which they remain tied to their ancestors. This is lineage. This is how they make sense or experience loss of people. Is that they're not gone? They're somewhere else, but they're accessible to us. They're in us. So death is less about finality. The more you define and contextualize death as at a biologic level, then it is irreversible, permanent, and final. But what everyone has done throughout time is see it as something that we're defined more than the cells that we're comprised of. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, because it definitely seems as a push on more of a technological advance, and we're completely distracted, and the industrial revolution obviously pushed that on, and the scientific revolution. Not to say that there hasn't been great strides there for people's health also, but I think we've lost. I'm not saying we should all be going out banging drums and howling at the moon around the fire every night, but I think that there's definitely a sense of, like, I notice it when I go out into nature myself. There's that sense of refreshness. You're recharging almost. You're in touch with maybe your roots, to something that we're not aligned with these days. We're more inside watching TV or on the phone completely, and it can't be good for our health. But I do think that's why more people are there's a more atheist, that new atheist movement is coming, because we're not thinking about the spiritual elements of things. We're not, we don't want to contend with them. We think of death when we're close to death's door more so when we're probably out of touch with the fundamentals of life. And I don't think it's good for political decision making in that front either, you know. I think there's a lot of, maybe going philosophically about it again, but there's a lot of Friedrich Nietzsche and, you know, all these guys warning about that coming a few hundred years ago. But it's amazing that the West has still held on to their traditions. So I listened to a podcast, the Undeniable, where the chief from Africa, I can't think of his name, but he was saying that when the Catholic regime came in, they transformed our very methods and our cultures. You know, they can't believe that so many people in the West believe in a spiritual being like a god, because they don't experience anything spiritual. He said, but we had our spiritual church was music to us. You know, it was getting together, it was, you know, highlighting it. And that was eradicated, unfortunately. So it is a shame that the world is turning more and more like this. And it just goes to show why you encountered maybe so many barriers with your research. No one wants to go near that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a more sophisticated approach is that the idea that somebody has the answer and they're pretty self-enamored with their technology or what have you, and disregarding the perceptions of and learnings of others. When really, I think where you end up is that, you know, we need to have greater openness, including cultural. And people have lived through the millennium with knowledge. The idea that we somehow newly invented all of this is humorous, but.
It's like almost lost knowledge to us in the West. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, do you ever hear of many religious figures being involved in these experiences? Because you can hear.
No, and we've wrestled with this a great deal, that we hear them, but not as common as you would think. And there's actually been some very good articles written by the religious on why this is. And there's a wonderful interpretation, which is that people don't speak of life and death in terms of the symbols of faith, but rather its tenets, the tenets of love, the tenets of forgiveness, and those are prevalent. So I think it's consistent with the core belief elements of religion without necessarily identifying the symbolic or the manifestations symbolically of faith. So they might not talk about seeing church and synagogue, but they certainly speak of love and forgiveness. So I don't think they're too incompatible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's nice to hear. And any new books on the horizon, or any more talks coming up?
No, so we wrote a book with Penguin Random House. I know it's in your country. I forget what the publisher is, Sarkis, or it's one of the large publishing houses, and it's called Death Is But a Dream.
Yes, that's right.
And it's the same publishing house that was used in England and the UK. And there's also a PBS special that's accessible of the same title. But what's really, I would recommend, if you can't do those things, is go to our website. And the reason why I say that is because there's videos of patients and families on there, and it's much more valuable than listening to me. And that's www.Dr Christopher Kerr with a K, KERR.com. And there's links to all sorts of patient family videos there. You really can't do it justice without hearing from them themselves.
That's great. Yeah, well, I'll post that link on it. And listen, I really appreciate you coming on, taking the time to speak to me today. It was an absolute pleasure having you on, and a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Really, thank you for reaching out.
Yeah, that's great.
Have a good day.
Same to you. Thank you, sir.